Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
I'm so glad you're joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on the George Floyd tragedy and its impact on the future of policing. George Floyd's disturbing death at the hands of Minneapolis police is already having an impact on how police departments around the country are training their officers. The goal is to respect everyone's civil rights while providing safety for all and making sure this never happens again.
In the days and weeks following the tragic death of George Floyd while under arrest by Minneapolis police, hundreds of thousands of Americans from many walks of life marched alongside the African American community, often under the Black Lives Matter banner. Devin Jacob is a former police officer and co-counsel on the George Floyd civil case. He says we need to pay attention to the outrage because it's based on reality.
There is a true problem in America that needs to be fixed. And that, yes, race definitely factors into the problem, but the problem is so much greater that the system needs to be rebuilt from top to bottom.
Jacob says if policing is truly to be considered a profession, all police officers should be trained according to the same national standards and be licensed, like doctors or lawyers. Former NYPD Assistant Commissioner for Training Robert Gonzalez says the three other police officers on the scene, along with Derek Chauvin, should never have stood by and done nothing. He says change is already underway.
We're teaching our police officers that if you see someone who's actually using excessive force, that you have responsibility to end that force. And if you don't, then you're just as guilty as the person using that force. So that's the new trend. That's what's happening, not just locally, but nationally.
Reforming police tactics is just one aspect of what needs to happen to ensure equal justice for all, says criminal defense attorney Charles Tucker Jr. The courts are also coming under scrutiny.
The foundation is institutionally plagued with racism. Let's address the foundation from its root. Let's start rebuilding it.
Don't be surprised if you start hearing more about the idea of police officers carrying malpractice insurance, too. There's much more to this. Let's find out what our panel has to say. Joining me for this conversation is Devin Jacob. He's a national civil rights attorney. He's also the co-counsel in the George Floyd civil case. He's also a former police officer. Devin, great to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you so much for being with us. Also joining us is Dr. Robert Gonzalez. He's an assistant professor of criminal justice at St. John's University and a former assistant commissioner of training for the NYPD and former NYPD officer for more than 2 decades. Dr. Gonzalez, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Also joining us is Charles Tucker Jr. He's a criminal defense attorney, handled many big cases from the local level, state, and also federal. He's also managing partner of the Tucker Moore Law Group, and he is a former prosecutor in Kings County, New York, aka Brooklyn. Charles, thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Lisa.
We really appreciate it. Charles, you've handled a lot of cases, a lot of different types of cases. With the incident where George Floyd lost his life, what outraged you the most?
Just the tragedy behind the whole incident. The disregard for human life on such a magnitude level, and the disregard by an individual who is charged to protect the public. In a span of 9 minutes, he not only ended the life for Mr. Floyd, unfortunately, but really put a black cloud on the good work that police officers are doing every day, to show that when one individual shows such a disregard and treat an individual in such an inhumane way, it hurt my heart to see that play out on the streets in Minnesota.
No, definitely. Dr. Robert Gonzalez, looking at that as a former police officer and somebody who did the training, we're going to talk about some of the tactics and techniques coming up in this show, but what was your initial reaction when you saw that horrific video that stunned so many of us and saddened us?
Well, like you mentioned, Lisa, I was stunned. And not just me, but every police officer. What makes this incident unique is that the community and the police both agree that this was abuse of force, abuse of authority, and criminal. my colleagues in law enforcement all agree that this was a murder that took place, and we all viewed it, we all saw it. So that's what makes this incident unique, and that's why there'll be a lot of changes, not just locally, but nationally in law enforcement, because police and community agree that this incident was the catalyst to a lot of changes that are going to take place.
Devin Jacob, when you're close to the family, you're close to the case, you're working with them on the George Floyd civil case. What was your reaction when you first learned about this?
Well, again, as a former police officer watching the video, it was just shocking that 4 separate police officers would believe that their conduct is okay as it's occurring. And this didn't happen in a back alley. This happened in broad daylight, on video, knowingly on video, in front of a crowd of people, which evidences the fact that this was systemic. This is something that these officers were comfortable doing out in public for the world to see, and were in a sense shocked when they were called on the carpet for their conduct.
So that's what struck you, was that it was almost this sick nonchalance, like this is business as usual, that type of appearance?
Yeah, the fact that today, in today's day and age, now that we have cell phone videos popping up all the time and we're reviewing this type of conduct or similar type conduct often, that a police department would still have officers who, again, they're not doing this at 3 a.m. in a dark alley, but broad daylight, heavy traffic in front of a crowd on display as if they're proud and look at what we're doing for you, community. That evidence is a real problem.
We have much more coming up right after this. Charles, when you saw that video of George Floyd that went on for so many minutes, you saw what was going on, that resonated, especially in the Black community, because of systemic abuse that Black men and Black women have endured at the hands of police that's gone unfocused and has not received that kind of attention. Give us a sense of the emotional charge of that.
Well, the emotional charges, Attorney Jacob pointed out, it spoke to a systemic issue that has plagued the Black community, arguably for decades, and in some respects since the inception of the police departments across the nation, which, by its formation, were laden with racism from its inception, which becomes part of the problem. It's like once you start an institution like that with such a dislike and a disdain for a group of people, mainly African Americans, and you try to dispense criminal policing or policing in some respect, and you do it in an unequal fashion and causing injury, deaths. Pick from all the major cities across America. We've seen it. We've seen it play out in New York with the Amadou Diallo incident. And the Black community is just sick and tired. Like, when does it stop? And we're hoping, and I believe a lot of African Americans feel that now that it's on Front Street, so to speak, thank goodness for the technology. The technology has caught up to the issue. Now it cannot.
It cannot be denied. It cannot be denied. Dr. Rob Gonzalez, as a former NYPD officer, you were in charge of the training that officers receive. We recall what happened with Eric Garner, who was put in the illegal chokehold and died from that. And then that resulted in different types of training changing with the NYPD. But when you look at what happened to George Floyd, what struck you about the way the officers were behaving?
Well, in different jurisdictions, they have different use of force policies. What needs to come out is there need to be one national standard spearheaded by the Department of Justice on use of force guidelines. Again, you have different jurisdictions that operate differently as it relates to use of force. With New York State guidelines and New York City guidelines specifically, based on my experience, again, we cannot do chokeholds here in New York City. What we're finding out in this particular case is the way that he was restrained was considered an acceptable tactic. And I find that just very disturbing. So I think the Department of Justice needs to step up They need to identify one use of force policy for every agency here in America. There are 17,000 law enforcement agencies, and depending on what state, what community, and what jurisdiction will dictate what your use of force policy is. So here in New York, it was extremely disturbing to New York City police officers. And again, I think all police officers thought that this particular incident was, again, very disturbing.
There was no way to explain it away, no way to justify it. Devin, what are your thoughts on that? Because you're part of a lawyers group nationally trying to create police reform. And again, speaking as a former police officer, how big a range is there and what's considered acceptable? And is it time for us to have some sort of national standard or national training standards for all departments, especially with our society so fluid and mobile now?
Well, I think Dr. Gonzalez hit the nail on the head, and that there needs to be a national standard that is overseen by the federal government. But I would almost go one step further. I think instead of it just being a policy from the Department of Justice, I think it needs to start with a legislative mandate. That way, the policy of the type of policing that's provided does not change from administration to administration. But to something that Attorney Tucker said, it's almost ridiculous to say that race doesn't play into this. Now, is race the only issue? Probably not. But the fact is, the preamble to our Constitution, we the people, referred to free white men. And they proceeded to create a racist, sexist document. And then when there were amendments to it, the 13th Amendment, for instance, freeing slavery, they made an exception for criminals. And then, of course, we had sharecropping and other type of programs that basically put largely Black people back into a criminal status. And policing that grew out of a handshake with the Klan and with other white supremacist groups to be slave patrols. And so to say that an organization that starts off on a set of laws by people who intended there to be racism in the system that was created, and then with organizations that were, again, intended to have a racist mission, and to say that today it doesn't factor in, it is simply ridiculous.
You say that's systemic. Charles, I see you shaking your head on that.
Absolutely. To trace it back, because when there's a problem, Lisa, in order to properly address it, you got to look at it and address it from its root. Otherwise, it continues. All you do is window dressing. You don't really look at the issues. But if you look at the issues from its inception and see how these police departments from its foundation was set up, and Attorney Jacob is right, they were set up to police mainly African American, as they was seen as the problem, the evil that needed to be, locked up, jailed, harassed, killed in some respects. And then it perpetuates, because once they're locked up, then the courts, dispense, Lady Justice has been peeking out from the blindfolds for years, right? We all know it. We practice in the courts. We see the unequal justice that gets dispensed. In some respects, she takes off the blindfold and she's looking, and she sees color. And it causes a disheartening for those who believe in, land of the free, home of the brave. We all are entitled to equal treatment under the law. And then when you lose the case and it's appealed, or you try to hold those who are accountable, which what they're trying to do in the Derek Chauvin case, the sovereign immunity, the law protects them. And it's like, when they break the law, isn't justice supposed to bring them into subjection of the law?
Charles, in terms of the case against Derek Chauvin and the police officers, the cases, since the civil case was already settled, is that going to play an impact in any jury's mind, or will that be able to be brought into the criminal case?
Okay, let me put my defense attorney hat back on.
All right.
Absolutely. I'm arguing that all day. If I was defense attorney, my change of venue motion would be boom on the judge's desk as soon as I heard that information. And in large part because the civil case is based on liability, right? The municipality was being sued for their failure to protect Mr. Floyd from the actions of the individuals involved. So if the liability is accepted and there's a settlement that is reached, and again, arguably for different reasons, and I'm not going to get into the reasons. And in fact, I agree on some level that, the settlement needed to occur. Question is timing. But if I'm representing Officer Chauvin, then the timing is everything. Because in this moment in time, I have to convince 12 people that my guy was following the rules and regulations set forth by the department. So if there's something out there now that shows there's a conflict, like no, that that he possibly was wrong, and they've accepted that, then yeah, I'm saying you've now tainted my jury pool, and
Right.
we need to take this trial elsewhere. And for my argument would probably be the egregious one, that the only place that this trial would be able to take place where the jury could not possibly be tainted is like the moon.
Right.
Because with technology and everywhere, everybody's gonna, there's no possible way. So judge, if you can't take me to the moon to try this case, I don't know how we're doing it. My client will not be entitled to a fair trial.
Right, especially with everything that happened in Minneapolis. Devin, looking around the United States, one of the issues that is concerning many people is what's acceptable. Obviously, different police departments now have different standards for how to restrain. All these things seem to come around restraining somebody when they're trying in the process of making an arrest. Either somebody that is, we saw with George Floyd complying with them. At other cases, that somebody trying to walk away, they try to restrain them or whatever. And sometimes they're just there and they try to restrain them, and something tragic happens. In terms of these use of force, like how is it really a very wide range of what's acceptable from your point of view?
It's more than that, Ish. I wish it could be just a simple policy change that is required. Realistically, there's, as we discussed earlier, there's certain ideologies that have been ingrained into policing and police agencies. And when you bring those to the street and you tell your officer that the standard the federal Constitution requires is that your conduct to be objectively reasonable, then the question becomes, objectively reasonable in our community, in our department, or objectively reasonable across the United States. It's interesting, though. I mean, George Floyd died in the streets, and it was horrific. But there wasn't a real call to change until corporate America began to burn down. And we have to remember that. And so now there is this movement to force change to make sure something like this does not happen. I hope it's not lost, but the memory span of the people of America, frankly, is very short. But there does need to be a national standard. That's what needs to happen at this point. And now's the time. The fire has been lit. And so now's the time to push that issue. And I think it's for the legislature to give a mandate to the Department of Justice to create a national standard and national training. Every other profession has it. In medical profession, we have national standards.
Right, that's true. I didn't even think about it that way.
But for policing to call itself a professional or a profession and then not to act like a profession with standards, it's ridiculous. It's time.
Rob, what about that? You've helped design training programs and looking at the training. What about national standards? I think there would be a tremendous amount of blowback against that, to be honest.
Well, there will be. But again, it's also up to the local legislators to sign on. We know that in New York City, after the George Floyd incident, there was legislation with the New York City Council to implement the I Can't Breathe policy, which some police officers feel it has handcuffed their ability to do their job. But if you're restraining an individual and he can't breathe, well, then you have to adjust your tactics, right? So it might start at the local legislature level or even on the state level, but there should be one federal mandate, perhaps even one federal czar, for lack of a better term, to oversee all misconduct of policing, right? Right now, it's all independent based on local law, both based on state law, but nothing federally, where the Department of Justice has full authority to implement a national policy of use of force. The same way after 9/11, they came out with a national policy on how to respond to disasters. And local law enforcement got funding to train their officers Well, now's the time to do that on a local police officer level so that the local agencies have one policy, one use of force standard. We educate the entire nation on what that policy is. That way, everybody looks from the same lens. There's no confusion on what's appropriate, what's adequate, what's ethical, and what's even legal. If we have one standard, then everyone will be on the same page, and now's the time to do it.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on George Floyd and the future of policing. You can watch the show again and share it with your friends on our Fox 5 NY YouTube page. I'm Lisa Evers. Remember, use your mind. It's your best weapon. Let's push for peace, love, and justice for all.